Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Dear students, today we are going to discuss the question of tragedy and tradition by Raymond Williams. Before discussing the question in detail, let's discuss the main points first. Points to remember. Number 1, introduction. Number 2, classical period. Number 3, Renaissance period. Number 4, new classical. Number 5, Lessing and the tradition. Number 6, secular tragedy. Number 7, Hegel and Hegelians. Number 8, Schopenhauer's concept of tragedy. Number 9, Nietzsche's concept of tragedy. Number 10, myths and rituals. Number 11, conclusion. Dear students, now let's discuss the question in detail. Tragedy and tradition. Raymond is one of the greatest post-war cultural historians, theorists and critics. He is a die-hard Marxist and looks tragedy with the peculiar context of Marxism. He thinks that tragedy is not something, the death of a prince. It is more personal and general. It can be experienced at very common human experience. A mining disaster, a burned out family, a broken career, and a smash on the road. All these can be tragedies, like the ancient classical tragedies of princes and kings. However, in his essay, Tragedy and Tradition, Raymond amplifies the meaning of tragedy and digs deep into the meanings of tragedy and gives his views about the different forms of tragedies throughout the history. In the opening of the essay, he says that the word tragedy has come to us from a long tradition. Certain writers and thinkers maintained the continuity of tragedy. They were of the opinion that they were contributing in the same idea and form. But this did not happen in actual terms, as all these writers and thinkers were only maintaining the continuity of the word tragedy, but not the substance of tragedy. Raymond thinks that this continuity embraced many variations. They usually try to make a contrast between the traditional and modern, and try to compress and unify the various thinking of the past into a single tradition. While explaining this point, Raymond says, it is a question rather of realizing that a tradition is not the past, a selection and evaluation of ancestors, rather a neutral record. He further remarks, to examine the tragic tradition, it is to see these works and ideas in their immediate contexts as well as in their historical continuity, and to examine their place and function in relation to other works and ideas, and to the variety of actual experience. This study will help to escape from the deadlock of the contemporary contrast between traditional tragedy and different forms of our own tragic experiences. Classical period. According to Raymond Williams, the plays that were written by Greek playwrights were more or less 300 in number. Only 8 to 10 survived through centuries, and these plays have extraordinary power. They are the product of mature Greek culture. These plays have left deep imprints on tragic drama. In the previous 1.5 century, efforts have been made to systemize Greek tragic philosophy, but these efforts have not yielded desired results, as there are evident and intractable differences between the three major Greek tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Moreover, it is a notable fact that the Greeks themselves did not systemize the idea of fate, necessity, and the nature of gods. The Greek culture was a complex of beliefs connected to institutions, practices, and feelings. There was a complicated web of myths. The Greek tragedy was a choral tragedy. When this unique Greek culture changed, the chorus, which was the crucial element of drama, was also discarded with it. Thus the unique meaning of tragedy was also lost. In Greek tragedy, the action takes its momentum from ruling families, having a legendary past and a noble standing between gods and men. The tragic hero involves representative eminence. He is not isolated one, he involves the whole system. Raymond is of the view that even Aristotle is concerned with generic action rather than isolated hero. Medieval period. The period that ensued classical was the medieval period. This is a period with little or no tragic plays. There are two grounds for this belief. Number one, the tragedy was then understood as narrative rather than a drama. Number two, the general structure of medieval belief had little place for the genuine tragic action, but this cannot be accepted true. Had it been true, there could have not been Elizabethan tragedy. However, the medieval concept of tragedy can be treated in The Monk's Tale by Chaucer, where he declares the fall of a high degree man into misery. This is the change from prosperity to adversity. Medieval tragedies hinges upon the idea of fortune. Fortune in the sense of chance, fate, or providence. Thus the medieval concept gave importance to the element of fortune. The medieval idea of tragedy is worldly, as fortune was taken in terms of worldly fortune. Thus the medieval idea of tragedy became more worldly than before. Raymond says, there might be particular sins which led to the falls, and at times these would be examined in the light of the doctrine, as the doctrine of fortune, as the ministering event of providence. The effect of medieval tragedy that is believed as continuity of tradition is by all means paradoxical. There is an apparent continuity in the emphasis on rank from Greek to the medieval conception, but this apparent continuity is in fact a reversal. The whole tragic action underwent a change during medieval period. It was a feudalistic society, so the medieval tragedy imbibed all characteristics of feudal Europe and made necessary changes in both the form and structure of the tragedy. There is limited scope of action in medieval tragedy. This gives birth to a very different concept of tragic hero. This development brought about the exclusion of conflict from the tragedy, and tragedy came to be considered as a story and account, but not an action. Renaissance. With the Renaissance, there began the modern age, which saw the coming of a new merchant class. It was a new social force destined to undermine the old social system based upon the feudals. Thus, under the influence of new learning, the main source of tragedy became the fall of a famous man. Raymond quotes Sidney to explain that the theme of mutability and its exemplary character is still dominant. This tragedy was interested in tragic methods and effects. This gave birth to a new tradition. It was Sidney who gave more attention to the methods of writing tragedy than to any moral or physical idea. In the Renaissance period, the idea of tragedy ceased to be metaphysical and became critical, though this development was not complete until the new classical critics of the 17th century. New classical period, it seems that the concept of tragedy maintained its tradition. However, this is not true in the face of facts. In this period, the new significance of exalted rank in tragedy again appears as continuity from the past. Socially, this is an aristocratic concept rather than feudal. Rank became essential as it accompanies style, but now a change was visible. The moving force of tragedy was now quite clearly a matter of behavior rather than a metaphysical fault. Now the emphasis is on an isolated character of the hero. A tilt in this regard can be seen in Aristotle's definition of character. This is described as a man not preeminently virtuous and just, whose misfortune, however, is brought upon him not by vice and depravity, but by some error. For example, Hamartia, in new classical period, the emphasis was shifted from change of fortune to change of heroes' fortunes. Lessing and the tradition. Lessing's major contribution is the theoretical rejection of new classicism, defense of Shakespeare, and an advocacy and writing of bourgeois tragedy. While rejecting new classicism, Lessing declares it as false classicism. He says that the real inheritor of the Greeks was Shakespeare and new national bourgeois tragedy. But according to Raymond, Lessing is partially true in this context, as new classicism is an aristocratic version of Greek tragedy, whereas Shakespeare is not the inheritor of Greeks. Shakespearean tragedy is a new kind of tragedy. Raymond thinks that Lessing has tried to roll both Greek and Elizabethan into one. Raymond is of the view that the similarity between Shakespeare and Greeks lies in the assimilation of comparable vision of human life. The essential character of Elizabethan tragedy is formed with an inherited order and element of new humanism. Lessing fails to understand all these differences. Secular tragedy. Raymond says if the historical development of the idea of tragedy is to be fully understood, we must look into the complicated process of secularization. All drama after the complicated process of secularization, all drama after the Renaissance was secular and the only fully religious tragedy was Greek. Elizabethan drama was thoroughly secular, but undoubtedly it retains Christian consciousness. In secular tragedy, there is great need to examine the complicated and contradictory emergence of new moral and metaphysical ideas. Tragedy, according to moral view, is the demonstrations of moral scheme. This tragedy is based on the need of poetic justice. Tragedy in this view shows suffering as a consequence of error and happiness as a consequence of virtue. If any tragedy which fails to observe it must be rewritten, but Raymond thinks that unexplained and irrational suffering in the real world eventually overthrew this version of poetic justice. Hegel and Hegelians. Hegel is a great German philosopher. Though he did not reject the moral scheme of poetic justice, yet he describes it as the triumph of ordinary morality, and the work that embodies poetic justice is a social drama rather than a tragedy. This new emphasis marks the emergence of modern tragic ideas. He believes that the important thing in tragedy is not suffering, but its causes. Moreover, their pity and fear are not tragic. In tragedy, the suffering on the active characters are entirely the consequence of their own act. These sufferings are not because of any external contingency or the circumstances beyond the control of the individual, such as illness, loss of property, death, and likewise. He thinks that for a genuine tragic action, there should exist the principle of individual freedom and independence. While pinpointing the differences between the ancient and modern tragedy, Raymond says that in the ancient tragedy, the characters clearly represent the substantive ethical ends, while in modern tragedy, the ends are wholly personal Moreover, in ancient tragedy, there is not only the downfall of all conflicting persons, it ends in the achievement of eternal justice. A character may surrender himself under a higher command. In modern tragedy, the whole question of resolution is more difficult because the characters are more personal in modern tragedies. Hegel's interpretation of tragedy is the part of his general philosophy, not a historical criticism. It emphasizes upon the conflict and its resolution. Bradley changed this emphasis from ethical to psychological, but later, under the influence of Marx, the conflict of ethical forces was looked in social and historical terms. Williams transforms Hegel's theory of tragedy in terms of Marxism. Schopenhauer. Before Schopenhauer, tragedy was associated with ethical crisis, human growth, and history. Schopenhauer contributes in the secularization of the idea of fate in a tragedy. He says, the true sense of tragedy is the deeper insight that it is not his own individual sins that the hero atones for, but original sin, for example, the crime of existence itself. In this respect, he is the forerunner of the tragedy. Sufferings are rooted in the nature of man, and these are not the product of historical and ethical considerations. Nietzsche does not negate Schopenhauer's tragic nature of life, but in Nietzsche's view, tragedy dramatizes tension that revolves in a higher unity, though the hero, who is the highest manifestation of will, is destroyed, but his eternal will remain unaffected. Moreover, he thinks that the action of tragedy is neither moral nor purgative, but aesthetic. Nietzsche also links tragedy with myth. To him, only myth is the source of tragic knowledge. Myth and ritual. Myth, according to Raymond Williams, is like heroic legend. Nietzsche believes myth as a supra-rational source of spiritual wisdom, and tragedy as heroic legend provide us a link between the Greeks and the modern. Myth and ritual are being used in this modern idea of tragedy as metaphors. Williams concludes, at the center of this ritual action is the tragic hero, whose inner conflict is the whole tragic action, and whose crisis and destruction can be seen as the ritual tearing to pieces and sacrifice for life. Thus, not only do we find the use of myth in a specifically modern sense to rationalize a post-Christian metaphysics, but the conversion of the ritual figure to a form of the modern hero, the hero whose liberal tragedy is also the victim, who is destroyed by his society, but who is capable of saving it. Dear students, the question of tragedy and tradition by Raymond Williams ends here. Let's meet in the next question. Take very much care. Allah Hafiz.